If you are wondering what equipment you'll need to get started formulating, you have come to the right place. Welcome to 10 pieces of DIY equipment for beginner formulators, part 2. If you are looking for part 1, the first 5, I have that linked in the description box below, along with the 2-part series I did on 10 ingredients for new formulators. So if you are a new formulator, definitely make sure you check out all of those videos. Something to keep in mind before we dive in is that all of the equipment that I am recommending and we're talking about today is all equipment designed for, selected for, its ability to help you make small batches of things. As a new formulator, you want to be making small batches of things. You'll be testing and trying new things and you're not sure what you're gonna like or if something new is gonna work, so you wanna make it in a small batch so that if it's awful, you can chuck it out without it being too heartbreaking. I also only ever really make small batches of things because I make a lot of different things and making new things and sharing new formulations all the time. So making big batches of something is just not an area of formulating that I really have any experience with. But without further ado, let's start with thing number 1. Thing number 1 is an immersion blender. So an immersion blender is an easy to find, easy to source, high shear blender. So it's got a spinning blade on it, which, in the world of cooking, you'd use this to like puree a soup. So this helps, really blend things together. So I primarily use my immersion blender for emulsions, creams, lotions, all kinds of beautiful emulsified products where high shear mixing is required. When you're shopping for an immersion blender, there are 3 main characteristics that I recommend that you watch for. The first one is how big this blender head is, because the bigger the head, the bigger of a vessel you need to work in when making your emulsions. And if it needs to be quite a wide beaker or jar or whatever, then you need a pretty big batch of product in order for there to be enough to submerge the blades. And you do want those blades submerged because if they're kind of poking out, they'll drag a bunch of air into your formulation, which is generally not what we want in a lotion. Another thing to look out for is how easy it is to take the blender head off. I disconnect this bit from this bit fairly frequently when I'm working, so I like it to be an easy to detach kind of thing. And then the last thing is just how heavy it is. I prefer it to be, on the lighter side, but that's very much a personal preference thing. So I do have this behemoth of a immersion blender and I really don't use it very often. I did a live unboxing of this back in 2020. It's really heavy. This head really is kind of a beast to unscrew and then screw back on. The manufacturer doesn't really recommend that you take it off. Especially for washing, you just take it off to just change the attachment. And so kind of between the heft of it and I really don't use this all that often. It's definitely more powerful than my little bronze secondhand one from Value Village that I bought over a decade ago, but I am not convinced that this was worth the hundreds of dollars that I paid for it. Most of that cost was actually the homogenizer head. The blender itself was cheaper than the homogenizer head. When you are out buying your first formulating immersion blender, you can definitely buy it used. I absolutely did. Don't go out and buy a multiple hundreds of dollar one because just a second-hand kitchen one will do just fine. The second item in our list today is a pH meter or pH strips. We use a pH meter or pH strips to check the pH of our formulations. Meters are a lot more precise, but also quite a lot more expensive, while strips are a lot cheaper, but also not nearly as accurate as a meter. If you're formulating with a lot of ingredients that have really specific pH requirements, I do recommend investing in a pH meter. As a new formulator, the ingredients that you are most likely to be working with that have really precise pH requirements are natural preservatives. If you don't want to shell out for a pH meter quite yet, I recommend sticking with formulations and ingredients that don't have really specific pH requirements. And I created a list and some further suggestions that are in the partner blog post, so if you want to check those out, it's always linked in the description box below my videos. If you're planning on buying strips, my friend Lise recommends the ones that have multiple little squares. And if you are planning on buying a pH meter, I have one from Apera, their pH 60. This is the only pH meter I have. I can't say like this is the best pH meter I've ever used because it's the only pH meter I've ever used, but I have had it for several years and it does work really well. I've been happy with it, so there's a link to this in the partner blog post as well. So our next item is gloves, a lovely hand-shaped barrier to go between your skin and your ingredients and the things that you make. I think the most important thing when you are buying gloves is that you make sure to get gloves that are comfortable, because the more comfortable they are, the more likely you are to wear them, and also the more kind of confident you are in your hands. If your gloves are way too big and you're just kind of slopping around in them, you lose a lot of dexterity, and frankly, I just find that to be like really unpleasant as part of my workflow to just have big baggy gloves dangling on my hands. When you're buying gloves, buy gloves that are manufactured in different sizes and buy the size that fits your hand so that it's, you know, it's not too small and it's not too big, it's, you know, Goldilocks, just right. These gloves, the ones that I am currently working my way through, they're Costco Kirkland brand, small nitrile gloves. They've been good. I've been happy with these gloves. I can usually get a couple wears out of them if I take them off carefully without turning them inside out. You know, I usually wash my hands to get whatever's on the glove off, and then I'll kind of very delicately remove them and like hang them up to dry so I can get a few wears out of them to reduce my use of single-use plastic. You can also get thicker rubber gloves, like the type you would use for dishwashing. They do have, I find, lower dexterity, and they're also warmer, so things can get a little bit more like swampy in them. So it's up to you. The next item on our list is pipettes for drop-by-drop dispensing liquid ingredients. Now, we're not measuring them by drop, dropping them into a thing on a scale to weigh them out by a drop, but it allows us to go, you know, just in very, very teensy-weensy increments. I have pipettes in two sizes. There's a bigger 3 mil and a smaller 1.2 mil. I use the 3 mil for things like carrier oils and hydrosols, and the smaller ones for things like extracts and fragrances and other things that are just used in smaller amounts. With ingredients that are safe to encounter at 100% concentration, like carrier oils, I'll use an elastic band to fasten the pipette to the side of it, tip up, so that I can use the pipette multiple times before it inevitably sort of splits, falls apart, and needs to be replaced. Don't try this with ingredients like preservatives, essential oils, and fragrance oils. The chance of that pipette then meaning that your skin comes into contact with the pure ingredient is just really high. So yeah, chuck them after that. And last but not least, number 10, just as I did with the ingredient list, item number 10, I'm giving you a choice between two items. Depending on what you are most interested in making, though of course you can always get both if your budget allows for it. So option 10A is a coffee grinder. So just a blade coffee grinder, no need to get a fancy burr coffee grinder. And this is for grinding stuff up. I use my DIY only coffee grinder a lot more than I think I thought I would when I first bought it. I use it a lot for making color cosmetics, so grinding pigments together. I use it a lot for making powder to foam cleansers. It's very helpful if you're making clay face masks, and say you want to include some dried botanicals in that clay face mask, pop everything in your coffee grinder, you get a nice smooth powder at the end. Or say you're making a surfactant product and it calls for sodium cocoa isothianate powder, but you only have it in noodles or in chunks, you can send that through your coffee grinder. If you do buy a coffee grinder for your formulating needs, you'll definitely need to make sure that you have a dust mask as well. I talked about dust masks in the honorable mentions part of part 1 of this, so that is over on the blog. When shopping for a coffee grinder, I recommend getting just something fairly standard. Don't buy a coffee grinder that brags about grinding enough coffee for 3 weeks in one go. That'll be much too big. Just kind of a normal blade coffee grinder works great, and as a fun little tip, if you put a piece of cling film over the surface of it before putting a lid on it, it really dramatically reduces the grinding volume and gives you a much faster blend. Option 10B is an electric beater set. This is for whipping things. If you have no interest in making whipped formulations, there's really no need to pick one of these up. Just like they do in the kitchen, electric beaters whip air into things. So whipped body butters, whipped scrubs, whipped creams, those sorts of things you'll want to use electric beaters for. If you're strong and determined, you could whip these things by hand using a whisk, but I gotta say, I am a very big fan of having the boost from electricity for such jobs. Electric beaters are not a good stand-in for an immersion blender, and an immersion blender is not a good stand-in for electric beaters. Beaters are designed to whip air into things, while an immersion blender is designed to puree things. They do very different jobs, so you can't You can't swap them around. If you need whipping, you need a thing that does the whipping, and if you need blending, you need a thing that does the blending. The electric mixer I have is a used one made by Oster, and it has been great. If you're aiming to start a business at some point in time, you may wish to upgrade to a stand mixer at some point in time. I know Ariane from the Filles de la Mer uses KitchenAid stand mixers to do a lot of different kind of mixing and stirring type jobs in her studio, so I linked to a couple of her videos showing that in action in the partner blog post. And that's it for part 2. You want an immersion blender, a pH meter or pH strips, gloves, pipettes, and a coffee grinder or an electric mixer. As always, please make sure you are reading the full partner blog post linked in the description box below. There's a few honorable mentions discussed there, so if you're thinking, like she missed something, it might be one of the honorable mentions. Who knows? You should read it and see. I'd love to know what your favorite piece of formulating equipment is, so if you could leave a comment on this video to share your love of your favorite like spatula or blender or coffee grinder with the wide world, that would be fantastic. But yeah, see you next time.